Imagine a family living in the shadows of a hidden danger until one night, their world is shattered. The Morrison family is wiped out, but why? What dark secrets did they uncover? As one detective dives deep into a web of lies and corruption, he's about to face a chilling truth that will leave you questioning everything. Stick around, because the twist at the end will blow your mind. This hook sets the stage for suspense and intrigue, pulling viewers in to watch the entire video. The streetlights flickered in the distance. A chilling breeze stirred the fallen leaves, scattering them like whispers. Hamilton Avenue was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that gnawed at the edges of your thoughts. In the dim light, the shadows grew long and twisted, as if they were alive. A figure walked down the street, their footsteps echoing on the pavement. Everything seemed normal. Too normal. But then, the door of the old brownstone house creaked open. Inside, the air was thick with tension. It had been building for days, maybe weeks. The family inside the house? The Morrisons. They were ordinary. At least, that's what everyone thought. A father, a mother, 2 young children. Neighbors saw them leave for work. Kids off to school. Smiles exchanged on the front porch. But something wasn't right. Not anymore. The father's presence had changed. He seemed distant. Cold. Eyes that once sparkled with warmth were now clouded. The mother, her eyes were haunted. There was a restlessness in her movements. She'd begun to stay up late, pacing the living room floor. The children, too, seemed unsettled. Whispers filled the air, unheard by anyone but the ones who lived in that house. But what were they waiting for? What had been set in motion? The answer would come tonight. The wind picked up. The door slammed shut, breaking the stillness. Footsteps inside. The phone rang, but no one answered. Then the sound of shuffling, heavy. A loud crash echoed through the house. The children's screams followed. And then silence. It was over before it even began. An entire family. Gone. Wiped out in a moment of chaos and violence. The streets outside seemed untouched. No one heard anything. No one saw anything. The Morrison house remained locked, dark. But something had changed. Something irreversible. The smell of death hung in the air. The lingering shock settled into the bones of the street. Neighbors would later say they'd noticed something strange, but no one could have known. No one could have known. The police arrived hours later. Their footsteps echoed in the empty house. A house that had once been filled with laughter. Now, there was only a suffocating stillness. They moved carefully, methodically. Every room, every corner was checked. But there were no signs of forced entry. The locks were untouched. The windows intact. Nothing had been stolen. The crime scene was hauntingly pristine. Then, in the kitchen, they found it. A single note, written in hurried, trembling handwriting. Don't trust them. The officers stood still. The chill in the air seemed to grow heavier. Who was the them the note referred to? It didn't make sense. The family was just gone. The children's toys lay scattered in the living room, untouched. Their favorite TV show paused on the screen. The officers exchanged glances. Something wasn't right. They moved upstairs, careful not to disturb anything. Each step creaked under their weight. At the top of the stairs, they found the first body, the father, lying face down, his eyes wide open, staring into nothing. There was blood, a lot of it, but no sign of a struggle, no signs of defense. Then they found the mother. She was in the master bedroom, curled in a ball. Tears had stained her face, but her mouth was frozen in a look of terror. The children, too, were discovered, both in their beds. But they were different. Too still. Too quiet. The officers began to feel the weight of the horror. Something had happened here. Something that could never be undone. But who could have done this? Who could have taken the lives of an entire family? As the investigators pieced together the events, one question lingered. What had led to this moment of destruction? There were no answers. Just the lingering smell of death, and the eerie silence that seemed to follow every step they took. The days that followed were filled with questions. Unanswered questions. The neighborhood had no answers. The neighbors were clueless. No one had seen anything suspicious. Nothing out of the ordinary. Everyone had gone about their daily lives, unaware of the tragedy unfolding just down the street. The investigation stretched on. Detectives scoured the family's background. There had been no enemies. No signs of financial troubles. No indication of domestic violence. The Morrison family had seemed perfect. But the deeper they dug, the stranger the pieces began to look. One of the officers found something unusual in the family's phone records. A series of strange calls. Late at night. Numbers they couldn't trace. The calls were short, brief exchanges, if any at all. The officers dug further, pulling up surveillance footage from nearby businesses. And that's when they saw it. A figure. A shadow. Someone had been lurking around the house just days before the massacre.
A man. Tall.
Unseen face. Moving quickly, disappearing into the night. The footage was grainy, but the chilling feeling was unmistakable. Someone had been watching.
But who?
The name Morrison appeared nowhere in the suspect's past. No connection. No motive. Just this shadow, this figure, who had been in the neighborhood. The officers scoured the area, knocking on doors. The neighborhood's residents hadn't seen anything. Yet, there was a growing sense of unease. The presence of something malevolent. Whispers began to circulate. Was it a random act? Or something darker? Something planned? The officers couldn't let go of the feeling that something had been set in motion long before that fateful night. And then one night, a breakthrough. A woman came forward. She lived 2 blocks away. She'd seen something strange. Something she couldn't explain. The woman spoke in hushed tones, as though afraid someone might be listening. She had been walking her dog when she saw a man standing outside the Morrison house. Just standing there. The man was staring at the house. She said he had a cold look in his eyes. Almost as if he was waiting. Waiting for something. Waiting for someone. Was he the one responsible for the carnage? Could he have been the catalyst? But who was he? And what had he wanted from the Morrison family? The woman's story sent a wave of unease through the investigation. The detective who took her statement felt a growing tension in his chest. This new information didn't fit the pieces they had. It didn't feel like a random act. This was deliberate.
But why?
The woman's description of the man was vague.
Tall.
Dark clothing. Unremarkable. But there was something in the way she spoke that suggested she was hiding something. The officer sensed it. He decided to visit her house the next day. She lived in a small cottage, 2 blocks away from Hamilton Avenue. The house was quiet when he arrived. Too quiet. The officer knocked on the door, and after a moment, it creaked open. The woman stood there, her face pale, her eyes wide, a nervous twitch in her hand. I wasn't sure if I should have said anything, she murmured, stepping back. The officer entered. He sat across from her in the dim living room, the air thick with the musty smell of old wood and dust. "Tell me again, what did you see?" he asked softly. She hesitated. "I saw him," she said, voice shaking. But it wasn't just him. He was with someone else. I didn't recognize the second person. But they were standing in the shadows. Watching. Waiting. The officer leaned forward, his breath catching. "Who was he with?" "I don't know," she whispered. "But I think they were part of it. Part of what happened to the Morrisons." Her voice faltered, and the officer's gut tightened. This wasn't just a random witness. This woman knew more. She had seen something she hadn't told them. The officer pressed further. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" The woman's eyes shifted nervously. I was scared. I didn't know if I should say anything. I thought maybe I was just imagining things." But then, she trailed off, her gaze flicking to the window. "But then I saw him again. A few days ago. He was standing outside my house. The officer felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. A chill washed over him. Something wasn't adding up. This wasn't just a single figure. It was a pattern. And whoever was behind it wasn't done yet. The woman's fear was palpable. She trembled as she spoke. "I don't know what's happening, but I think he's been watching all of us." The detective stood up, the room feeling colder now. "Thank you," he said, his voice tight. "We'll need you to stay in touch." As he walked out of the cottage, the weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Something was coming, and he wasn't sure if they could stop it in time. Who were these figures? And what did they want with the Morrisons? The answer was out there, but it was slipping through their fingers. The investigation took a darker turn after the officer left the woman's house. The unsettling feeling that had begun to creep into the case now gripped him entirely. There were more pieces to this puzzle, but they were scattered and unclear. The detective returned to the Morrison house, where the silence felt suffocating. The walls, once filled with life, now seemed like they held secrets. As he walked through the rooms again, something caught his eye. A photograph. It had fallen from the mantel, its edges slightly curled. The officer picked it up, feeling an odd sense of dread. It was a picture of the Morrison family at a park, smiling. But in the background, behind the joyful faces, there was something strange. A shadowy figure. Barely visible, but unmistakable. The officer's heart skipped a beat. Could this be the same person? The one who had been lurking around? He took the photograph back to the station, where his colleagues were already poring over the case files. They hadn't seen it either. The figure was unmistakable, though. It was the same shadow, the same tall figure they'd seen in the surveillance footage. But who was he? And why was he in the background of the Morrison family's photo? Was it a coincidence? The detective wasn't sure anymore. He examined the photo again, feeling the weight of the unknown press down on him. He ran the image through facial recognition software, hoping for a breakthrough. But the results came back empty. The figure wasn't on any police record. Not even a hint of his identity. Frustrated, the officer took the picture to the woman who had seen him standing outside her house. The woman looked at the photo and recoiled. "That's him," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This is the man I saw. The one who was with someone else." The officer's mind raced. The pieces were starting to fit together. But it wasn't enough. They needed answers. They needed to know why this figure had been stalking the family. What was his connection to the massacre? And who was the person he had been with? The detective didn't have the answers yet. But one thing was becoming clear. This was no ordinary crime. This was part of something much bigger. Something deeper. And it was only just beginning. The detective couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the Morrison case was leading somewhere far darker than anyone had imagined. The more he pieced together the fragments, the more the sense of danger grew. There was something orchestrated about it, something planned. The figure in the background of the photo, the shadow in the surveillance footage, wasn't acting alone. The woman's report had confirmed that. But who was the second person? The one hidden in the shadows, always just out of sight? The detective couldn't let go of that question. He combed through the records again, looking for any connection between the Morrison family and others in the neighborhood. There were no obvious ties, no links to known criminals or gangs. But then something caught his eye. A series of subtle financial transactions. The Morrisons had made large, anonymous donations to a local charity in the months leading up to their deaths. Odd, but not suspicious on its own. However, the detective noticed the charity was tied to a man with a criminal past. His name was Victor Kane, a shadowy figure who had managed to stay under the radar for years. He was known for his connections with underground organizations, but no one had ever been able to link him to anything substantial. Until now. Kane's name had shown up in one of the anonymous transactions linked to the Morrisons. A small donation, barely noticeable, but enough to spark suspicion. The detective's gut told him it was important. He ran a deeper background check on Kane, hoping to find some connection to the family. And that's when he uncovered something chilling. Victor Kane had been to prison years ago, convicted of several violent crimes. But the real twist? He had been released just a few months before the massacre. The timing was too perfect. Had the Morrisons been targeted because of this man? Was there something in their past, something they had been involved with, that had led to their brutal deaths? The detective felt the weight of the case press down on him. The pressure was mounting. He couldn't ignore the strange, twisted connections anymore. The pieces were all there, but it was still so hard to understand. What had they uncovered? Who had been behind this? The answers, it seemed, were buried beneath layers of deception, lies, and long-forgotten secrets. And the detective knew that until he could crack the code, the shadow of the Morrison massacre would remain. The discovery of Victor Kane's name sent the investigation into a whirlwind. The detective, now more certain than ever that Kane was involved, began reaching out to his old contacts, those who might know more about him. As he dug deeper into Kane's life, a pattern began to emerge. Kane's past was filled with whispers, rumors, and a trail of destruction that no one wanted to acknowledge. It wasn't just that he was a violent man. He had a certain presence, a reputation for getting things done, things that made even the most hardened criminals uneasy. He was the kind of man who could make things disappear. But why would the Morrisons have been on his radar? The detective's mind raced through the possibilities. Had the family been caught up in something they didn't understand? Had they unknowingly crossed paths with Kane or his associates? Or had they been targeted from the very beginning? The more the detective thought about it, the more it seemed like the latter. The family had been involved in something, and they had paid the price for it. But the question was, what? And why was Kane involved? The detective turned his attention to the local charities, hoping to find something, anything, that would shed light on the Morrisons' involvement with Kane. It was there, hidden deep within the charity's records, that he found the link he had been searching for. The Morrisons had not just donated money. They had volunteered. Not just any charity work. They had been involved in a project that Kane himself had overseen, an initiative aimed at providing support for troubled youth in the area. The charity had been a front for something far more sinister. The youth were being groomed, manipulated. Some of them had vanished from the streets altogether. The detective's heart pounded in his chest. What had the Morrisons gotten themselves into? The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. Victor Kane wasn't just a figure of violence. He was a manipulator, a puppet master pulling the strings from behind the scenes. And the Morrisons, with their good intentions, had unknowingly stumbled right into his web. Had they realized what they were walking into? Had they tried to back out? The detective couldn't ignore the feeling that the family had been doomed the moment they became involved with that charity. It wasn't just a massacre. It was a warning. And it wasn't over yet. The detective knew he had to act fast. Because the shadows that had claimed the Morrisons weren't finished. And they were closing in. The walls of the case seemed to close in on the detective as he realized the depth of the Morrison family's involvement with Victor Kane. The more he uncovered, the more the terror of their final days became clear. The Morrisons had been in too deep. Their charity work, which had seemed so noble at first, had turned into a trap. The initiative was a cover for something far darker. The troubled youth they had been working with weren't just looking for help. They were being recruited into something criminal. The detective couldn't help but feel a growing dread. The Morrisons must have discovered the truth before it was too late. Had they tried to escape? Had they tried to warn someone? The thought of the family's last moments, struggling to understand the horror they had walked into, gnawed at the detective. He felt an urge to speak to the people who had known them best, friends, colleagues, anyone who might have seen the warning signs. As he spoke with their closest friends, one name kept coming up. A former colleague of the father, Liam Turner. Liam had worked alongside Mark Morrison at the charity. He had been one of the few people who truly understood the inner workings of Kane's operations. But Liam had vanished the day after the massacre. The detective's gut tightened. Had Liam discovered something? Had he too tried to escape? He dug into Liam's background, searching for any clues to his whereabouts. What he found made his skin crawl. Liam had been involved in the charity from the very beginning. He had helped set it up. And he had known Kane well. Too well. The deeper the detective dug, the clearer it became. Liam had known the truth all along. Had he been working with Kane? Had he been part of the plot? Or had he been another victim, another pawn in Kane's twisted game? The detective couldn't be sure yet. But what he did know was that Liam's disappearance was no coincidence. Someone was trying to cover their tracks. The night grew darker as the detective pieced together the final connections. The time for subtlety was over. He needed to confront Kane. But the more he thought about it, the more the detective realized something chilling. Victor Kane wasn't just hiding in the shadows anymore. He had become the shadow. And he wasn't about to let anyone expose the truth. The weight of the realization hit the detective like a punch to the gut. Victor Kane was no longer a figure lurking in the background of the investigation. He had become something much more dangerous. He was no longer hiding. Kane had woven himself so deeply into the fabric of the community, into the lives of those around him, that he was untouchable. The detective could feel it.
Kane was watching him now.
Each step he took in the investigation seemed to be one step closer to a trap. The walls were closing in, and Kane was always 2 steps ahead. He could feel the eyes on him, and it wasn't just paranoia. It was a cold, relentless certainty. The detective gathered his team, sharing the growing sense of urgency. They had to move fast. Liam Turner's disappearance couldn't be ignored. His connection to the Morrisons, to Kane, was too crucial. But as the detective sat in his office, staring at the stack of evidence, something unsettling lingered in the back of his mind. Why hadn't they heard from Liam? If he was involved, surely he would have made contact by now. Was he being kept quiet? Had he been silenced? The detective's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was an anonymous message. "You're getting too close. Stay away from Kane, or you'll end up like them." The message sent a chill down the detective's spine. He knew it. Kane was watching.
Kane knew everything.
And now, the detective had become a target. He immediately went to work, locking down all possible leads. He couldn't let Kane win.
Not now.
But even as the detective closed in, the feeling of inevitability settled in. The city was growing darker, and with every passing hour, it felt like they were sinking deeper into a nightmare. He couldn't ignore it anymore. The case was bigger than he'd imagined, and the shadows surrounding it were getting closer. Was he ready to face the truth? Or was he already too late? The detective knew one thing for sure. The closer he got to Kane, the more dangerous things would become. But he couldn't stop now. He had to finish it. He had to find Liam. And he had to bring Kane down. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real horror was yet to come. The detective's mind raced with a threat that loomed over him. Kane was closing in, tightening his grip on the investigation like a vice. Every lead, every clue seemed to slip further out of his reach. But one thing kept him focused: Liam Turner. He was the key. Liam knew the truth. He had to. The detective knew that if he didn't find Liam soon, Kane would ensure he never did. The phone call came at dawn. It was a local informant, someone who had seen Liam in a rundown part of the city the night before. The detective's pulse quickened. This was it. Liam was still alive. The informant described a meeting in an abandoned building on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place where criminals vanished, where things could go unnoticed. The detective gathered his team. They couldn't afford to waste time. The abandoned building was cold, dark, and oppressive. Every step echoed as they moved through the damp halls, searching for any sign of Liam. The silence seemed too perfect, too unnatural. Then they found it. A room in the back of the building. The door was slightly ajar. The detective pushed it open, his heart pounding in his chest. Liam Turner was sitting in the corner, his face pale, his eyes hollow. He looked like a man who had been running for his life. Liam looked up as the detective approached, his expression a mixture of fear and resignation. I knew you'd come, Liam whispered, his voice shaking. But it's too late. What happened? The detective asked, kneeling beside him. What did Kane do to you? Liam's eyes darted around the room, as though expecting someone to burst in at any moment. He didn't just kill them, Liam said, his voice cracking. The Morrisons, they were in too deep. They were trying to stop him. They tried to get out, and that's when Liam's voice faltered, and the detective could see the terror in his eyes. They didn't realize how far Kane's influence stretched. They didn't know the people he controlled, the people he would do anything to protect. The detective felt his chest tighten. Where is Kane now? Where is he hiding? He asked urgently. Liam shook his head, his eyes filled with dread. He's always a step ahead. He'll come for you too. He'll make sure you never leave. Before the detective could press further, a low, menacing laugh echoed from the shadows of the room. The detective's heart skipped a beat. And then he saw him. Victor Kane stepped from the darkness, his cold eyes locked onto the detective's. Kane's smile was chilling, knowing. You shouldn't have come, detective, he said, his voice calm, almost mocking. This was never about you. The detective's instinct screamed. But before he could react, the door slammed shut behind him. Kane had planned everything. And now there was no way out. The detective's heart pounded as Kane stepped closer, his cold gaze never leaving him. The room, once silent, now seemed to hum with a suffocating tension. Liam's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, as if he knew what was about to happen.
Why?
The detective demanded, his voice steady despite the chaos that was rising inside him. Why kill the Morrisons? Why all of this? Kane's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't one of amusement. It was something darker, almost pitying. The Morrisons were just in the way, Kane replied. They had something I wanted, something that could have ruined everything. But more importantly, they became a threat. They weren't supposed to know what was really going on. They tried to stop it. The detective's blood ran cold. What are you talking about? What is all of this? Kane stepped even closer, now mere inches away. The detective could feel the heat of his presence, the danger that radiated from him like a palpable force. It's bigger than you realize, detective, Kane said softly. You've been digging into a hole that was never meant to be uncovered. The Morrisons, they got too close to the truth. And now, so have you. You think you're the hero in this story? You're not. You're just another pawn. The detective's mind raced. He had thought the Morrisons' deaths were the end of the story, a senseless act of violence. But this was something else entirely. Kane was no simple criminal. He was the architect of something much larger, something that had been hidden in plain sight for years. But it was too late. Kane had anticipated this. Every move the detective had made, every question he'd asked, had been carefully manipulated. A sudden rush of adrenaline surged through the detective's veins, and in that moment, he knew what he had to do. He had to stop Kane, even if it meant his own life. Before he could act, a sharp noise echoed in the dark room, the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. Liam's eyes were now wide with terror. Get out of here, Liam whispered, his voice barely audible. It's over. And with that, the final act of the tragedy began to unfold. The tension in the room was unbearable. The detective could feel his heart racing, every muscle in his body braced for what would come next. Kane stood in front of him, the gun pressed against his side, his cold smile still lingering. Liam, shaking with fear, had no intention of helping him escape. You think you can stop me? Kane's voice was a low growl, barely more than a whisper. There's nothing you can do. You're already trapped. This is bigger than anything you can understand. The detective didn't answer, his thoughts racing. His instincts screamed at him to act, to make a move, but he knew time was running out. Kane's reach was too vast, and his grip on the city too strong. He had been playing this game for years, and the detective was just another piece to be discarded when it was no longer needed. But then, In the silence that hung heavy between them, the detective realized something. This wasn't just about him, or even about the Morrisons. This was about a system, an empire built on secrets, on people who thought they could control everything. Kane thought he was untouchable, but he had underestimated the will to fight. In one swift motion, the detective lunged, knocking the gun from Kane's grasp. The room exploded into chaos. The detective's instincts took over, every movement sharp, calculated, but with a desperation fueled by the knowledge that if he didn't act now, it would all be over. In the struggle, the gun went off. The loud crack echoed through the abandoned building. The detective's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't hesitate. He fought with everything he had, and in the end, it was Kane who fell, his dark eyes wide with shock. The detective stood over him, chest heaving with exhaustion, sweat dripping from his forehead. The room was silent again, but the weight of the moment was far from gone. Liam was gone. Kane's empire shattered. The detective knew the war wasn't truly over. There were more shadows waiting to rise. But for now, at least, the cycle had been broken, and the Morrisons and countless others would no longer be forgotten.